He cast a suspicious look at us, and without a word he headed toward the group of 3 sentinels. He started coughing loudly, speaking at high volume and chuckling, in order to incite the German sentries to show themselves. In fact, one of them was intrigued enough to stick up his head. Then the French officer took a sentry's rifle, and aiming slowly, carefully, and in a most cowardly way, sent a bullet right through his head. As a result, the Germans blasted away at us all day long with rifle shots which tore our sandbags to shreds and made all surveillance impossible. We were quite lucky that none of our sentries had his head blown off, and to think that this lieutenant was the most decorated officer of the regiment. "Our sentries aren't doing their duty," he said to me severely. He no doubt was convinced that he had just carried out a most noble act. Should one complain about, or blame, or excuse, or curse those whom nature has granted such a perverse and unfeeling mentality? On August, our section went into reserve, 80 metres back from the front line, in a support trench for a week. Our main daytime task consisted of making hedgehogs which, come nightfall, had to be thrown out beyond the outposts. For the uninitiated, I'll explain that herrisons were prickly bundles of barbed wire wrapped around 4 iron ingots bound together in the middle. In making these herrisons you risked tearing your sleeves, your trousers, or your skin, and in pushing or tossing them around the outposts you risked catching a bullet on the fly, or being caught by a grenade. I'll never forget how my little rookies, far from balking at this night work, didn't manifest the slightest fear, and insisted that I stay down in the boyau, not wanting me to expose myself without absolute need. "You're the father of a family," they said to me. "Stay down. We'll do just as fine without you." One night we got an alert. Men from the so-called free sections, operating in no man's land, came back through the squads, having been summoned to the colonel's command post. Orderlies and messengers rushed in every direction, bearing orders. What was going on? The wind was in our favour. They were going to launch against the Boche the famous poison gas, for which we had been preparing for so long. Nobody within my hearing was particularly happy about this operation. There was going to be a big bombardment on both sides, and from what the patrols told us, we might have to occupy certain enemy positions. While waiting, our section was going to occupy a jumping-off point in a part of the trench with no shelter at all in which to protect ourselves from the likely bombardment. Soon we learned that the time was set for midnight, the hour of crime. But you could say that the wind was guilty of collusion with the enemy. At 10 minutes to midnight, the wind was blowing too hard. They postponed the business to 2 in the morning, but by that time the wind had stopped blowing altogether, to the point where it wouldn't have moved a candle's flame. The order came down to go back to our dugouts. A reprieve of 24 hours was granted to the Kaiser's subjects who were swarming throughout Champagne. Then the next night a strong mistral was blowing. They had to postpone the emission once more, but the Boches were happy to wait for the night of August 15th to 16th for a wind which was neither too strong nor too weak. Without the slightest respect for the holiness of the day, all the dispositions were made ready for 11 o'clock that evening. But here we are at 10:30, when the wind suddenly turned from south to north. It would have been suicide for us to launch a gas attack. If Boreas, the god of the winds, hadn't been high up on Olympus, beyond the reach of the military authorities, he would have been indicted for thereby betraying the cause of righteousness and civilization. Headquarters was furious at these setbacks, or rather blowbacks. In contrast, the poilus, who had nothing to gain by this emission but the risk of a violent bombardment, were delighted that the sector stayed calm and peaceful. Finally, during the night of August 19th to 20th, our company went for a week of rest at Camp 1, 2 kilometres in front of Somme Sweep. Camp Y was made up of barracks which contained, as furniture, a kind of floor to lie down on. That was all. Primitive man at least had tree trunks or big boulders to sit down on. For eating they had a hearth. For sleeping they had dry leaves and some moss to lie on. This was rough comfort, to be sure, but we would have been very happy with it in our relative nakedness. Furthermore, we were all completely infested with ticks. So it was with pleasure that we went to Somme Sweep to take showers in a model bathing facility, paid for by Her Majesty the Empress of all the Russias, if you please. We had never been showered and disinfected like we were in this imperial installation. While we were in the showers, our effects passed through a superheated brazier, where ticks of every generation, from those who had not yet burst from their eggs to the old black hairy ones, were smothered without reprieve. This was a memorable day. After many months, this was the first time we didn't feel the slightest itchiness. It was enough to make us call out, "Vive la Tsarina!" Despite my revulsion for tyrants, thanks to her we were going to spend a couple of restful nights. One night out of two, the companies went up to work in the trenches, sometimes at the front lines, from which we were a dozen kilometres away. The next day, after having made the 24-kilometre round trip and having done 7 or 8 hours of work, the men came back exhausted. "What a galley slave's life," they said. "Boy, if we ever get through this," proclaimed others. Some were in such despair that they didn't even have the strength to complain. I was lucky to get out of this forced labour, since I found myself on assignment every time my turn came up. One afternoon we had a military parade. It was the occasion for awarding Croix de Guerre to those who had won them, more or less deservingly, at Cote 304. Our company had the honour of handing out the honours. Our Capitaine Adjutant Major, our old friend the Kronprinz, had the duty of pinning them on the chests of all these worthy soldiers, in the name of the fatherland, of the President of the Republic, of the Generalissimo, etc. The Kronprinz seemed quite moved, weighted down by such a great honour. He had the company form up in a square and ordered a musical salute. But we had present only one bugler, who had a cracked instrument, and a drum with a skin so worn that it sounded like an old cauldron. The salute was sounded all the same, amid outbursts of laughter which this cacophony provoked. The rite was carried out, and if the ceremony lost some of its grandeur, that's too bad. The Kronprinz turned a severe look upon us, and began the reading of the exploits accomplished by each awardee, as he fastened the Croix de Guerre onto the recipient's greatcoat, and gave him the traditional accolade, the kiss of the fatherland. The bursts of laughter came forth once again. Really, these poilus had no respect for anything, but this time there was good reason. You would have thought that this was the first time he had ever embraced a fellow man. Apart from his obvious repugnance at placing his lips on the leathery skin of the poilus, he was so near-sighted that the visor of his cap kept him from approaching the patient's face, and his big spectacles got hooked on the awardee's nose and fell to the ground. Or his own nose, of a prodigious prominence, got tangled in the poilu's moustache or beard or collided with his helmet. The officers themselves couldn't keep from smiling. It was as much a vaudeville show as it was a solemn ceremony. The captain alone did not smile, and fled the scene as soon as he could, haughty and stiff. One night, all the circumstances appearing favourable for the launch of a gas attack, we were put on alert. But at the last minute, as a result of either the force or the direction of the wind becoming doubtful, the gas wasn't launched in certain places, while in others it was. The result was mediocre. Among the engineer troops who handled the equipment, several succumbed. On the Boche side, some of our patrols reported that trenches were filled with dying men who were yielding up their souls to God, but little Yver, who was part of the 296th Regiment's reconnaissance, swore to me that he and his comrades had stayed concealed between the lines, and then made their way back after having made up and memorized a phony report crafted by the head of the reconnaissance team. That made our big bosses happy, satisfied by the effectiveness of the gas as well as the scouts, who all came back at such little risk. Our Colonel Robert showed his scepticism, however. He sent the volunteers back to their companies without giving them Croix de Guerre or stripes or home leaves. The gas containers which were not emptied that night were buried deep in the ground, because it appeared that after a certain time they would lose their toxicity. We would have to find stronger insecticides to chase away the Boches who infested our soil. Suddenly the rumour spread that our division would be relieved. On August 28th, the relief of frontline units began. While the replacement troops were passing by, heading for the trenches, a violent storm broke out, followed by a deluge of biblical proportions. How pitiable were these men, bent double under this onslaught of rainfall which further drenched their sweat-soaked bodies. We urgently awaited our own relief. Would it take place in similar weather? We were no doubt eagerly awaited in the Somme, where the battle was raging. But no, it was a month and a half before we got there. For now we would have field exercises and big training manoeuvres for the open field warfare, which our high command, as blind as ever, believed to be imminent. To shelter the troops from the storm in the many camps which were lined up just to the rear of the trenches, there was plenty of room, would have been an act of humanity, of common sense, of simple duty on the part of the bosses. It would involve just a little bit of consideration for the health, for the physical suffering of their troops. But in wartime, rain doesn't matter. Even if hailstones as big as your fist had been falling, the relief would have kept going all the same. Too bad if those who got through it would later suffer from aches and pains, rheumatism, sore backs. It was for the patrie. On August 29th, in the course of the morning, our battalion left Camp Worst. We were leaving Champagne, a relatively quiet and restful sector, to go to a place of horror, to know once again the bad old days of Vermelles, Lorette, Verdun. We left joylessly, but after having marched 4 kilometres we had the pleasant surprise of finding a truck convoy which carried us to the village of Lettres. This village had 32 inhabitants in peacetime and 28 when we arrived. You can imagine how comfortably our battalion would be quartered in such a small place. They told us that we would be leaving soon, but while we were waiting, no doubt so we wouldn't get bored, our daily exercises were undertaken right away. Our captain being away on leave, it was Lieutenant Gueule de Bois who took command of the 15th Company. It would take too long to recount all the injustices, petty crimes, inspections and punishments which he afflicted upon the company. This character would have been the ideal commander for a chain gang of convicts. No one dared to venture more than 50 metres from the encampment, for fear of missing an assembly, an unscheduled roll call. No one dared to laugh, to speak freely, to make the slightest noise, for fear of attracting his Nero-like gaze. The Somme offensive, in the blood-soaked mud, August 29th, TP November 1st, 1916. No one dared to rest or even to lie down outside of the appointed hours, for fear of being observed, because this odious character was always worming his way into the midst of groups, mixing in quietly, suspiciously, looking to pick up a few shameful statements or opinions. The daily reading out of orders took at least a full hour. He would pick 3 or 4 squads at random for roll call, just to make sure nobody was absent. If he heard someone whispering, he'd form the company into a square and make the guilty party stand in the middle and say out loud what he had whispered. If the blabbermouth stayed silent, then it would be work details and punishments for all of us. There was always something, and usually several things, to present. Arms, tools, or other items, all of course perfectly clean and in good shape. He checked each one personally. Not far from Lettres there were several good-sized villages, but you had to have a damn good reason to get authorization to go to any of them. One evening, nonetheless, I took a jaunt to Bussy. The category of rear echelon slackers on duty there seemed to me to be the only thing worth commenting on. They were the Russian interpreters, that is to say Frenchmen who had the unhoped-for good luck of speaking Russian and were promoted to officer's rank in a day's time. They waited in this village for the Russian troops arriving in France to ask for their services. On September 1st, the 37mm cannon team was formed, and I was assigned to the 4th Machine Gun Company. It was with regret that I had to quit my little rookies, to whom I'd become quite attached, but I wasn't leaving them altogether, since we'd still be in the same battalion. On September 4th we left Lettres without much regret, and after a rather hard march we came to billets at Trouan-le-Grand, which the width of a river separated from Trouan-le-Petit. We were near the Camp de Mailly, where the Russian troops were stationed at this time. At Trouan you could see the traces of a combat which had taken place, the inhabitants told us, on September 9th, 1914. Starting the next day, without even having the customary day for getting settled in our new billets, the training began, or rather continued. But what a change for me! I could scarcely believe it. No more roll calls and parades. The hated field exercises were nothing more than distractions. A few brief series of manoeuvres with our cannon, a few breaks for talks about theory, and that was it. We quickly learned that it was not much more than strolls through the countryside and nice siestas in the shade of the bushes. I have to say that our commanding officer was a far cry from Gueule de Bois. He treated us like comrades, and he spared us plenty of work details, dangers, and stretches of boredom. He had only one fault. Who doesn't have one? Sometimes too strong a whiff of wine or booze reached his nostrils, and when that happened, watch out. You had to be careful not to cross him or contradict him. He was like a champagne bottle with the cork 3/4 of the way out, which something makes explode and all the bottle's contents burst out. But if he lashed out and injured someone with too sharp a reproach, he was the first to apologize and admit his mistake. This officer was Sub-Lieutenant Lorius, the same one whom a sentry from my squad almost dispatched with a hand grenade. He never made the slightest reference to that incident, ever again, nor did I. He was a former non-com from an artillery regiment who was enticed into the infantry because of a desire for a gold officer's stripe. From dawn to dusk, the regiment was subjected by the terrible colonel to an intensive training regime across the Meili steppes. Men came back exhausted, saying that they missed the trenches, which is saying a lot. In the evening, we'd hear the songs and the prayers performed in unison by the Russians at the Camp de Mailly. The men would assemble at attention, as if for an inspection. That astonished us. Some of us made our way over to the camp, just to watch this unbelievable spectacle. On September 14th, I had the great joy of obtaining my second home leave, 7 months after my first one. In the night of the 16th-17th, having come on foot from the station at Meaux, I had the pleasure of seeing my loved ones once again, and forgetting for a few days, too quickly gone by, the hard reality, the primitive life of the trenches, so far from civilization. On the morning of the 24th, I had to pull myself away from the sweetness of family life, to take the rough road back to the front lines. I was going to leave on the tram from the village of Trauser, 3 kilometers away. My wife alone accompanied me. My dear little ones had preferred to kiss me goodbye at the house, which troubled them less there than at the tram station. From the station I could see once again all my relatives busy at work, harvesting a nearby patch of grapevines, and I wondered if next year I could come and be there with them, this frightful war being over, to help my poor father in this rough work. Here and there, amid the vines laden with fruit which the gentle sun was ripening, appeared groups of grape-pickers, gloomy and silent. There were only children, women, and old men. When would the joyful harvests return, in which young people contributed their laughter, their games, their songs? I departed with a heavy heart, pulling myself away from those who, without thinking, without any special interest, without any hypocrisy, love you with all their hearts. I was going back into the realm of the bitterest egoism, to die amid the indifference of all who surround you. The next day, at dawn, I was at Orléans. A few minutes later I took the train to Champagne. It was so crowded that I had to scramble up to a lookout post, and at 5 in the evening I got off at the mustering station of Jessens, where they told us that the regiment had left for the Somme. At 8 that evening we embarked for the mustering station of Creil. Nobody complained about the length of the journey. It was that much more time to enjoy in liberty and in safety. 24 hours later I got off in Amiens. Traversing the city, I went to the Saint-Roch station to wait for the departure of a train which was supposed to leave at 7 in the morning. It was then 9 in the evening. Several hundred leave-takers filled the station and spilled out onto the sidewalks, worn out by the fatigue of a long voyage. I did the same. What an idea, I thought, to call this station Saint-Roch. He was a saint from where we come from. There were even relics of this great saint in a chapel in a village near Peyriac, the same place from where I embarked on my return trip. It seems that he had protected the village from a number of scourges. I prayed to him to protect me from catching a nasty cold in this chilly autumn evening. I was stretched out next to some young fellows, Belgians who had fled their country when it was invaded, now reaching 20 years of age, in the conscript class of 1917, called to the colours at Rennes. They were waiting for the same train as me. Like me, they would no doubt have preferred to be lying in bed somewhere, rather than on the sidewalk. While we weren't enthusiastic about it, we didn't complain. which wouldn't have done any good anyway. The next morning I got off at the station of Namps, and after covering 10 kilometres on foot, I finally discovered the regiment in the village of Tilloils-Conti. In view of the part we were to play in the Somme offensive, the regiment was subjected to an intensive training programme. There were field exercises in full campaign gear, from morning to evening, signifying a return to open field warfare, as if they had not yet seen the negative results of this bloody offensive. On October 6th, trucks carried us toward the front, but it was not our turn yet, or maybe we needed a bit more training. They dropped us off at the village of Hamlet. At the entrance to the village, we encountered a column of German prisoners. Some cynics maintained that they were placed there on purpose, to boost our confidence, so that seeing them would encourage us. Every evening we could witness the tragic show which the front lines of the Battle of the Somme put on for us. The sky was crisscrossed with flashes, illuminated, lit up with meteoric bolts, sudden bursts of light, all accompanied by a deafening, continuous rumbling. We felt like we were watching a gigantic volcano, seeing the sinister reflections of hell itself. "It's just like Verdun," said the veterans, worried, "but there will also be cold, rain and mud." The young ones were terrified before this frightful tableau, just right for inspiring horror of war and filling the soul with terror. On October 9th, after the morning meal, we left Hamlet to the tune of a lively polka played by the regimental band. A funeral march would have been more appropriate. Our route followed the valley of the Somme, but here and there marshlands had overflowed. Sometimes the road had to climb the steep hillside and then come back down a little farther ahead, resulting in much fatigue from following this roller coaster course. At nightfall we arrived at an immense camp, and they piled us into barracks where we went to bed pell-mell on the hard, damp floor. This was the camp of the Bonfray farm. No symmetry, few barracks built yet, but all sorts of shelters in tent cloth, or made from planks, busted-up crates, tree branches and trunks, etc. Some English officers were installed in elegant cabins which spared no comforts. This camp, where thousands of English recruits learned the noble profession of arms, covered several hundred hectares of terrain. It was a veritable human anthill. On the roads which crisscrossed the camp passed innumerable convoys of automobiles, trucks, heavy caissons, all sorts of vehicles, relief columns, ambulances, etc., day and night. They had put down railway lines which were hauling heavy shipments of material, munitions, foodstuffs, etc. All sorts of goods were warehoused and piled up everywhere. To see this intense life, pulsating without a break, made you dizzy. Your eye couldn't see the limits of the camp. Your ear took in and identified the different sounds, the jumble of noises, which mixed with the rolling cannonade in the background. Near our barracks some monstrous English artillery pieces, on platforms and on rails, fired 100-kilo shells from time to time onto the Mont Saint-Quentin. We stayed at the Bonfray farm until October 19th. We made profitable use of this time by once again taking up our training of new methods, irresistible ones this time. Now we would show them, 100 times over. Each evening, to bolster our morale, which might have been weakened by the lamentable sight of the regiments coming back from the trenches, our regimental band played us the most engaging mazurkas and waltzes, right in our cantonment. This made up for the less harmonious sound of the cannon, or even more disagreeable, of the rain which ended up turning the camp into a muddy marsh after some particularly heavy downpours. We listened avidly, shivering, to the tales of suffering endured by those who came from the trenches and who still had the strength to smile. Seeing that there was no way we could escape from this trial, we were impatient to leave, and nothing was more nerve-wracking than the false alarms which often came, putting us on alert. The top brass couldn't comprehend how free men, who had been free right up to the minute the war began, could submit without the slightest murmur, almost voluntarily, to this sacrifice which they knew to be in vain, useless, with more docility than a troop of slaves in ancient Rome heading to some unexpected slaughter. And our bosses weren't mistaken. They knew quite well that it wasn't the flame of patriotism which inspired this spirit of sacrifice. It was simply a sense of bravado, to not seem more cowardly than one's neighbour. Then there was the presumptuous faith in one's own star. For others, it was the secret and futile ambition for a medal or a sleeve stripe. Finally, for the great mass, it was the uselessness of protesting against an implacable fate. The fears of our chiefs that they would see the soldiers waver, then rise up in revolt in an instinctive burst of energy, like the lowest, stupidest beast facing certain death, were therefore groundless. But living too far away from the soldier, and too high above him, to get to know his state of mind, they covered themselves in ridicule by an odious comedy which would have wounded the common soldier's sense of dignity if he'd known about it. One morning, here is what they dreamed up. A mendacious note announced that the 296th Regiment would not be going up to the front lines. They would simply busy themselves at night, getting the sector ready to be occupied by the English, who it seemed weren't especially good at this kind of work. Happy to get out of it so easily, each of us breathed a sigh of relief. But the next day came Act 2. We learned that a group of young officers, humiliated by this decision which they considered as lack of confidence in the regiment, addressed a plea to the general, asking for the honour of going into combat alongside two other regiments of the division, the 114th Regiment and the 125th Regiment. The following day came Act 3. The general hastened to grant us the favour of going to gather up the laurels of victory. It was our turn. Just like that, we had forced the hand of our bosses to go slog in the mud and have ourselves cut down by the Boche howitzers and riddled by their machine guns. On October 18th, the bombardment reached a hitherto unseen degree of violence. The order came down to be ready to leave camp at any moment. A cold shower fell, and we shuddered at the thought of leaving camp in such weather. But it wasn't until the next day that we went up to the front lines, to the place of sacrifice for those who would spill their blood and end their lives so miserably. On October 19th, at 1 in the afternoon, the 296th left the barracks of Bonfray in a driving rainstorm and went up to occupy the front lines near Combles. We came upon a half-destroyed village, Maricourt. Only the cellars were occupied, by territorials who watched us march by with an indifferent look. They had seen plenty pass by over the past 4 months. Farther along, we passed through the village of Hardcourt. Few of us even noticed it, because there was hardly anything left other than a few foundations here and there, ruins and debris of all kinds, torn up, pulverized, with mud and huge chunks of earth churned up by the whirlwind of projectiles. A kilometre farther along, the road descended into a ravine, at the bottom of which ran the tracks of a narrow-gauge railway, where by night, not without danger, long lines of freight cars brought up to Combles tons of projectiles, which our cannons spat out without taking a break. Where the road crossed the tracks stood what they called the station of Maurepas, named for the village which extended along the opposite slope of the ravine, but whose inhabitants had nothing to make the citizens of Hardecourt envious. They too wouldn't recognize where their houses had stood. From that point on, we entered the range of fire of enemy artillery, and Maurepas could have been called Pas de la Mort. To get to Combles, we abandoned the road, which was used only at night, and we followed the railroad tracks along the ravine. This ravine must have been the scene of fierce combats, blasted tree trunks pulled out by their roots, shattered wagons and carts, all sorts of debris, rifles, bayonets, grenades, German shells, scattered around or piled up. We marched past in silence, seemingly indifferent, under ceaseless rain which soaked us through and through, but which didn't stop the cannonade. It seemed to grow more violent the farther along we got. Finally, at nightfall, the battalion gathered in a bend in the ravine, 2 kilometres from Combles. They were generous enough to grant us 2 hours of rest before we renewed our climb to Calvary. By 7 in the evening, the night was dark. The sky seemed to take pity on us because the rain had stopped. Off we go. My little rookies from the former squad came up to greet me. Maybe this is the last time we'll see each other. The little Breton Maurice Yver, to whom I had lent 2 francs, pressed a 40-sou piece upon me. "Hey," he said to me, "in case they kill me, we're even. Thanks." I couldn't care less about 40 sous just then. I refused. He insisted. Did he have a premonition of his impending death, this poor boy who would soon be blown to bits by a German shell? Maybe he did. Up to that point, we'd had mules to haul our little 37mm field guns, but from now on it was upon our shoulders that we had to carry the cannon and the shells. The piece is broken down into 2 parts, each of which weighs 40 kilos. We take turns carrying them, while others carried the munitions. The team for our gun, composed of 6 men, had to follow the 4th Machine Gun Company. After a hard march of 5 hours in the rain, we understood the effort that would be needed for this new foray into impracticable terrain in an opaque night. On either side of the widening valley soon appeared the ruins of Combles. A few carcasses of houses were still standing, but probably not for long, because each day the German shells poured down upon these ruins. After passing through Combles, we left the railway line, and crossing the fields, we met the road from Combles to Morval and Sailly-Saillisel. This was no more than a road dug up by shell fire and full of mud, but protected by an embankment. At the end of a half hour, no more embankment, no more trace of road, only the dark and sinister plain. We had to follow pathways which snaked around the shell holes full of water. Soon we were at the end of our strength. The 2 men who carried the dismounted cannon had to be relieved every 1 or 2 minutes. Sometimes one would slip and fall and couldn't get back up. We had to help him, crushed by the weight of his burden, stuck in the mud. And to think that if a wind of demonic madness hadn't swept across the minds of the people's leaders, we could, at this very hour, be quietly at home by the fire, with a warm bed awaiting us. How we would mock the rain, the cold, the wind, the night. Our good Lieutenant Lorius, who had come up with our field gun, begged us, urged us not to stop, not to lose contact with the machine gunners up ahead, whose last stragglers often disappeared from our view. Several times he himself went ahead to ask the officers of the machine gun company to slow their pace. Finally, we reached a protected road, or a stream bed, we couldn't tell which, full of mud, which we could follow only by moving carefully along its edge. They told us that we'd arrived at the commandant's post, and consequently we'd have to wait there until they determined where on the front line our gun would go. Against the embankment, between the protruding roots of some shattered tree trunks, the men of the team we had just replaced had dug out 2 holes to squeeze into, but they weren't big enough to hold all of us. The lieutenant chose 2 men to accompany me back to Combles, to find the field kitchens and the supply train, and to come back the next day with food and munitions. It was 10 at night, almost 12 hours after we had left the camp at Bouffray. How many more hours did we have to go? And alone, without guides, wouldn't we get lost? I couldn't count on my 2 comrades, who didn't seem particularly enterprising, and were certainly incapable of doing 200 metres on good road. We soon met up with a company in relief, heading to the rear. Thinking that it was headed for Combles, we had the bad idea of following them. I soon realized from certain landmarks that we were on the wrong road. I asked those whom we were following. They were from the 77th Regiment and were headed to the Bois des Trônes to go into reserve duty. We asked them if they had passed by Combles. They had never been there. We bade them farewell. Now here we were, sitting pretty in the middle of this lugubrious plain, now deserted all around us. We resigned ourselves to spending the night right there, for fear of getting even more lost, when all of a sudden a battery of 75s started firing a couple of salvos right nearby. I dragged my comrades toward this battery. The guards there could tell us the way to Combles. We came upon a miserable road, snarled with heavy caissons and limbers, some of which we saw were completely stuck, being pulled by double and even triple teams of horses, who struggled and themselves got mired in the mud. Ah, what a shame! War is bad for everyone, beasts and men alike. At 1 in the morning we arrived at Combles. The town, bombarded around the clock, looked deserted. Only an occasional horse artillery team galloped through, disturbing the fearful silence which weighed down on the ruins. Completely at the limit of our strength, we decided to lie down in whatever sheltering hole we came across. We ended up finding, in the middle of the ruins, an orifice, an opening under the corner of one of the few houses still standing. We were already savouring the thought of a few hours of rest and sleep, which we needed so badly. When entering this space, we were almost suffocated by the unbearable odour of rotting carrion. To our utter horror, by the gleam of a flashlight, we saw the bodies of 6 Germans. They had no doubt been killed by the detonation of some enormous shell, because they stood as if petrified, in poses so natural that you'd think they were still alive. Disgusted and disagreeably impressed, we fled from this tomb. As we left this inhospitable village, we came upon a cylindrical shape, right at ground level. It was one of our big artillery pieces at rest. It was in a bunker, covered with a canvas tarpaulin painted in neutral colours to camouflage it from the enemy's view. There was nobody around this gun. The artillerymen, those lucky devils, must have been snoozing away in a fine shelter somewhere. We snuck under the tarpaulin and rolled up in our damp blankets, stretched out on the cannon's gun carriage. Like Turenne on the eve of battle, I said to my comrades. But these poor fellows had never heard of Turenne. They thought he was someone in the company. No, you imbeciles, I spat at them. He was a famous, illustrious general. But for these poor young bucks, a general is someone who orders other people to kill one another. Ah, the bastard, they said. I hope he croaked. By now the sky had cleared and it grew quite cold. We could feel the mud hardening under our feet and cracking as it froze, while in our Midi the nights are still generally mild in October. Fatigue is a powerful narcotic, and despite the cold and discomfort of our position, we fell into a deep slumber, to the point that we didn't hear the explosions of some big shells which fell nearby. But at daylight the cold woke us up. We shivered, and our feet were senseless, numb, so it took us a few minutes to stand up. We headed toward the place where, the previous evening, the battalion had assembled. We had the good luck of finding there the 3 caissons of 37mm guns, ready to leave, harnessed to their teams. But the drivers didn't know where the supply trains and the field kitchens were. Someone had said they were somewhere near Maurepas. As we proceeded, we picked up some details which were not encouraging. The field kitchens, which had set up at Combles the evening before, then had to withdraw during the night, nobody knew where, because of the shells falling in and around Combles. Peyriac's Louis Richardis, cook to His Highness the Commandant Quinze and His Eminence the Kronprinz, had one of his comrades killed outright by a shell burst. A less disturbing detail, but quite bothersome for our daily sustenance. The field kitchen of the 4th Machine Gun Company was shot full of holes, to its great glory, but a great misfortune for us. We arrived at Maurepas, or at least what had been Maurepas, because you couldn't find a stone or a brick. The stones and bricks had been gathered up by the territorials, who used them to pave the roads at night. At the centre of the village was a jumble of vehicles, caissons, and field kitchens from various regiments, but not the slightest trace of the Biterrois regiment. We had already emptied our mess kits and ration bags that morning. A soggy piece of bread and a chocolate bar transformed into blackish paste by the rain made up my only meal since we had left the Ferme de Bonfray. We were hungry, and for a hungry man the animal instincts take over. Fond yearnings for our cooks and our field kitchens pushed aside those we had for our wives and our children, who couldn't do anything for us. Our thoughts were also with our comrades on the front line, standing in the filthy stream, anxiously awaiting our arrival this evening. They won't get indigestion from overeating. Helpless, we decided to post ourselves by the side of the road, in hopes that we see someone pass by wearing the fateful 296 patch. We were in luck, in the form of a horseman, the simple orderly of some brass hat, who had no idea how anxiously we awaited him, and how joyfully we spotted him. He told us that the supply train and the field kitchens had been ordered to Hardecourt. A half-hour later we were at this village. It was 3 p.m, but the field kitchens had not yet arrived. They were stuck in the mud, up to their axles in a bad stretch of road, and could arrive only much later that evening. We were lucky enough to discover in Hardecourt the cellar of a vanished house, stuffed with straw, the height of luxury. We took immediate possession of it, by right of first occupancy. But we were barely there a half-hour when a detachment of engineers arrived and, under pretext that this cellar belonged to a detachment which they had just relieved, they ordered us out. "Messieurs," I told them, "you're too late. Are you the owners of this cellar?" "No, I didn't think so." "Well, we're here, and we're staying put since we got here first." They went to look for their officers, but nothing came of it. We declared that we would leave only by force, and we made it clear that this would not be without resistance. There were no constables, no policemen, no gendarmes in Hardecourt to expel us. They had to abandon this cellar to us, and we had, for this brief relief, a precious refuge against the cold, the rain, and even the shells which fell upon Hardecourt from time to time. It was much later that night that we were able to resupply our comrades on the front line. It had been 2 days since they'd had anything to eat or drink, when we had trouble finding them, and we called out, "Cannon 37, Sergeant Gautier." You can imagine how quickly they swarmed out of their mole tunnels. The truck drivers lent us a hand in the resupply effort, so that we could rest every other night. Every evening at 5 p.m., as night fell, 2 of us brought supplies up to our comrades: wine, coffee, letters, and packages, and sometimes a sack of shells. This wasn't easy duty, 25 kilometers to cover, in moonless nights, on bad roads and invisible pathways which crisscrossed each other, where it was easy to get lost, all the while dodging shell fire. But what a difference from those who had to stay in the trenches without the slightest shelter, feet in the water, enduring frequent downpours, the cold, and above all the bombardments. The Germans, if they rarely fired on the rear, sent shells in abundance onto the first and second lines of trenches. Nevertheless, our artillery fired on average 4 shells for each of the enemy's 1. To endure such an avalanche of projectiles, the Germans kept only a screen of sharpshooters and machine gunners at their front lines. Those folks were spread out in big shell craters and dug little pits there, where they burrowed down and protected themselves from fragments. Since they brought up enough rations and munitions for the duration of their watch duties, they hardly ever moved out of their holes. In a war like this one, combat meant mostly being a target for shells. The best leader wasn't the cleverest tactician, but rather the one who knew best how to keep his men alive. On this subject, our leaders had a lot to learn from the German bosses. It's not that the latter were more humanitarian, but they had the intelligent care to conserve human resources. One evening, when it wasn't my turn on ration duty, I had already bedded down for a good night's sleep ahead, when the sergeant major of the 4th Machine Gun Company made an unlucky appearance, ordering me to carry an urgent dispatch to Lieutenant Lorius, commanding the detachment of a 37mm cannon. No doubt these were urgent orders for an attack, I thought, but when I indiscreetly read the dispatch, I was stunned. There were at this time several models of gas masks in use. They were asking all the unit commanders, like Lieutenant Lorius, for a report stating the number of such and such a model being used, pronto. And that was why I was being ordered, that night, to go out and find our officer, risking death 20 times over, along roads transformed into quagmires. But you had to obey. What could one say? What would have happened if tomorrow our headquarters didn't know how many gas masks of Model X or Z there were in our group? The sergeant major assured me that I would find Lieutenant Lorius in a fortified bunker near the Combles railway station. Had I been notified earlier, I could have accompanied the ration team, but now I had to make my way alone to Combles. Lucky me, the German guns were unleashing salvos on the town. There were a few moments of ominous silence. Then suddenly came the sinister shrieks, and then the massive explosions, the blinding flashes, the sound of falling debris and crumbling walls. To complete this frightful tableau, 2 munitions dumps had just blown up. It looked like a fireworks display, with columns of smoke and flame rising to the clouds which reflected them. Earth and sky seemed ablaze. At the risk of being court-martialed for not obeying orders, I was beating a retreat toward Hardecourt when I ran into 2 engineers who told me that the officer I was looking for must have sought refuge in the catacombs, like everyone else. According to them, these so-called catacombs were very easy to find. I had only to climb out of the ravine, take a road which would lead me into the village, and then to the square where I would see the ruins of a chateau. That's where they were. I found the road, which was nothing but a muddy quagmire which split into many pathways across the rubble, and while I was wandering in this ghastly solitude, the shells began raining down even more abundantly. At each whistling shriek I flattened myself against a bit of crumbled wall or a tree trunk, and I waited for the avalanche of stones and iron to finish cascading down before taking up my course once again. There was no one from whom I could ask the slightest bit of guidance. What was least reassuring was that I'd be as incapable of finding my way back as I was in finding these famous catacombs. I was gripped by despair. "Ah," I said to myself, sagging against a bit of wall, "I might as well die here as anywhere else, right now as well as tomorrow." But at this tragic moment a vision flashed across my mind like a lightning bolt. There in my distant home, my cherished wife, my 2 babes with blonde curls, my white-haired mother and father, kneeling at prayer at this very hour, pouring all their hearts, all their souls into it, with grave faces, bent in anguish for the absent one, for me. I don't really believe that prayers, as sincere as they might be, have the power to deflect bullets or shells. But there's something about the mind, detaching itself from all else, concentrating for one moment on one memory, on a single thought of someone dear. That's an act of faith, of love, of hope. No, I had to escape death as best I could, to get away from this accursed place. I broke into a run and found a road in the middle of which an ambulance was ablaze, smelling strongly of gasoline. In the fire's light I saw a field kitchen, which had imprudently come as far as Combal's, shattered on the ground. The kitchen's 2 horses lay moaning on the ground, and nearby were 2 men, bathed in a puddle of blood, coffee and wine. That night a company in the trenches will await its rations in vain. This will be a day of fast which they will accept without a murmur, without a complaint, once they hear what happened. I leaned over the 2 unfortunate ones. One was missing his head, guillotined. The other had a leg blown off at the thigh, and probably other wounds as well. At this moment a squad of territorials appeared, nocturnal road workers, peaceable shovels and picks at their shoulders, already going forth at the first pause in the bombardment, to clean up and repair the damage to the roads and the pathways, which must be maintained practicable at all costs. If not, tomorrow and the day after, our cannons would be silenced, our wounded couldn't be evacuated, our men in the trenches couldn't be fed. This duty of the territorials was not without peril. Often some of them spilled their own blood into the mud which they were cleaning up. Their little crosses lined these roads. Observing them, I felt like a lost voyager in the desert, coming upon a caravan. I asked them where I could find the catacombs. "We've just left them," they said. I was just a few steps away. A pile of rubble, a passageway across, an opening, and a gently sloping descent into a long, deep underground passage, with a vaulted ceiling dug into the white clay earth. To the right and the left a large corridor led to other, smaller ones. You could see actual chambers all along the way. Offices, telephone centres, first aid stations, sleeping quarters, mess halls, storage rooms for gas masks, tools, sandbags, weapons, etc. Down there was a constant coming and going, incessant activity. In vain I asked if anyone had seen any officers from the 296th Regiment. I decided to wait for daybreak, and I stretched out on a pile of gas masks belonging to evacuated wounded. Although they were both muddy and blood-stained, I stretched out with sheer pleasure, and nothing came along to trouble my sleep. Who had built this underground complex? Was it the Germans? Had it been there before the war? I couldn't get answers about any of this. In any case, it was a safe harbour, a refuge in the midst of the storm. At dawn, I went out to the railway station to see if I could find Lieutenant Lorius there, but this was in vain. I then returned empty-handed to Hardecourt to rejoin my comrades who were wondering about my fate. Each evening, in the cellar which served as our refuge, we hardly got any sleep since the rationers of the 3 gun crews hadn't come back. At least we knew what had happened, and we had some assurance that help was on the way. Each day I went to the field kitchens of my old companies, the 13th and 15th, looking for news. The men were suffering from the bad weather. There were frequent downpours of freezing rain in the mornings, and naturally there were also wounded and killed. You don't make omelettes without breaking eggs. One of my former little bleus, poor Yver, who had given me back 40 sous the day we came up to the front, had burrowed with 2 of his comrades into a little cavity dug into the trench wall, upon which a big shell landed, pulverizing all 3 occupants. Periax Paul Alpech had just left the same shelter not 5 minutes earlier to go for food, and Yver had taken his place. That's how the war went. Fate determined our life and death in the tiniest circumstances. October 23rd, 1916, is a memorable day in the annals of the 296th. The previous night, the officers were advised that the next day the regiment had to attack, with the objective of taking the first German line. During the night, the men were kept busy digging parallels, trenches extending ahead of our own front line, to shorten the distance for us to cross at the moment of assault. It happened that the 4th Battalion, our own, in the darkness, pushed this parallel too close to the German trench, and we had to be especially careful that they not discover the work being done right under their noses. When, the next day, the fog lifted, the Germans were astounded to see the French a few steps away from them. Since those folks waged war like we did, constrained and forced into it, they judged it useless to defend themselves, and unanimously raised their arms, crying, "Comrades, comrades!" However, some of them were scared stiff, and profited from the lingering fog and reigning confusion by taking off. As a result, there were only 52 in our hands. Various incidents took place. The well-liked Lieutenant Cordier, commanding the 14th Company, marched at the head of his men and was the first to leap into the enemy trench. Seeing a tent cloth covering a dugout, he tossed it aside. A German adjutant asleep inside fell out of bed, and when called to surrender, answered with pistol shots at our officer, who was hit by several bullets but who, magnanimously, captured the German and prohibited anyone from harming him. Farther along, a German soldier couldn't get out of his hole. One of our guys reached a hand out to him, saying, "Come on, climb out, lazybones." To the Frenchman's surprise, the other answered him in our own language, "I'm not a lazybones. You're a Frenchman and I'm a German." In the area around the trench, they found the body of an enemy officer, his head bashed in, and beside him a shovel covered with blood. It seemed clear that when he didn't want to surrender, his men had gotten rid of him. Another officer, haughty and furious about his misfortune, was conducted to the post of the commandant, who was absent. When the latter arrived, the German wouldn't budge. Lieutenant Guillot, commanding the 13th Company, was there, and said in German, "Hey, salute, it's the commandant." The Boche wouldn't move. Second request, same disdainful immobility. Lieutenant Guillot gave him a hard slap on both cheeks. The German went pale, then red, and then he saluted with rage in his heart. Meanwhile, at the same hour, the same minute, the 6th Battalion pushed forward. But, put under machine-gun fire, the men flattened themselves in shell holes. Otherwise, it would have been a total massacre. The losses, nevertheless, were considerable. They had to be relieved that evening by the 5th Battalion. 5. On October 25th, our 4th Battalion was relieved, and to rest on our laurels we went into reserve in a barren, desert-like ravine to the rear of Combles. But an unfortunate counter-order put our 37mm cannon at the disposal of the commandant of the 5th Battalion. That same evening, it was my turn to go get the food, with our driver Castet and the ration team from the 5th Battalion's 5th Gun, Thumazou and Fraisse. The latter, who had been born in Olonzac, land of good wine, in the middle of the Minervois, had a Rabelaisian face. Blessed with a solid appetite and fresh-faced, rosy-cheeked and plump, he breathed joie de vivre from every pore, from the roundness of his belly, the tranquillity of his step, his double and even triple chin, to his peaceful and mocking expression. Philosopher without knowing it, he saw the best side of every occurrence, always ready with a joke or a colourful expression, getting seriously agitated only at the prospect of some sort of day of fast, even at the height of Lent. The 2 rationers from the 5th Battalion's field gun had already been in the Circe trench where we were going, but after we'd gone past the colonel's command post, in front of the dark and gloomy plain where several pathways crossed each other, they hesitated, uncertain about which was the right road to take. Luckily, 2 liaison men came up, heading for the front line, and were quite willing to serve as our guides, as long as they could lighten our load of food a bit. They weren't mistaken, because at every moment, in every direction, the German batteries were unleashing frightful volleys of shell fire. but the two liaison men were carrying only a few scraps of paper. We were carrying bundles of jerrycans and musette bags, which made walking difficult. Frace was especially weighted down, overloaded like a mule. Furthermore, the roundness of his belly threw off his centre of gravity. Pursued by bad luck, he was always stumbling into one shell hole or another. After each caper, he lost his orientation, and we sometimes had to put him back on his feet, which would have given us much to laugh about in another time and place. The only point of reference in this darkened plain, where no tree, bush, or tuft of grass remained, was a single telephone pole, with two others holding it up, or it was holding them up. From time to time our guides would crouch down and scan the horizon, to seek out these poles outlined by the light of some luminous flare or explosion. Finally they spotted them. We were a few meters from them when a particularly shrill whistling made us flatten out in a shell hole, without being told to do so. No one was harmed, and these shells weren't made of chocolate, they were the real thing. It was pure fate. We got up. "Hurry up!" cried our guides. But a second whistle, a second flattening. No damage again. But the liaison men picked up the pace. We were near the Bois de Morval, a place which usually was quite heavily bombarded. At that moment I thanked Providence for having blessed me with long legs, which allowed me to follow the guides. But it wasn't the same for my three comrades, who called out frantically, "Barthas! Barthas! Wait for us!" I implored these orderlies to be willing to wait for a minute or two, which they did, not without complaining, while the shells kept raining down. "We're only 200 meters from the Circe Trench," they said. "We need to get there in one bound. Are you all here? Let's go." You'd have thought the German gunners had heard this as a signal to unleash a formidable barrage. 200 meters, that's not much, but how long they seemed in those moments. Running, stumbling, sloshing through water, through mud, in the midst of explosions, of flying metal, chunks of clay. You're nothing but a frightened beast, obeying the instinct of self-preservation. Finally, here is the Circe Trench. It's the safe harbour, salvation. We don't jump in, we fall into it, we collapse. It is deep with inhabited holes here and there, with solid ladders. We're saved. But Caste stayed too long in a shell hole. Frace capered about like a clown. Thumazou, nearsighted by day and blind by night, had wandered off to nobody knew where. I had to gather them up. Caste, half dead with terror, and Frace, who looks like an enormous block of mud, finally show up. But the Auvergnat Thumazou didn't arrive, and didn't answer our calls. Had he been hit, the unlucky one? Once the bombardment had passed, we looked for him, we called out, nothing. Here I am, really annoyed. What am I going to say tomorrow when they ask me, where did Thumazou go? To hell with this Auvergnat. To hell with my corporal's stripes. How much trouble they've caused me, and to what good? But no matter whether Thumazou is alive, lost somewhere, or pulverized out there, we need to find those to whom we are delivering rations. In this ravine there is an end of the Bois de Morval. In a jumble of half-destroyed trenches are a number of deep, solid shelters built by the Germans. They know right where they are, and at least one enemy battery has its sights fixed right upon these shelters and their surroundings, where salvos of shells fall day and night. Our commandant had to give up using these precious shelters, which were crumbling little by little. This sinister corner became a resting place for couriers and signalmen, people used to playing hide-and-seek with falling shells. But at night our little field guns were useless, and their gun crews as well, so they came to seek refuge in these risky shelters, 5 minutes of danger for a long night of security. But just try to discover, in a dark night and in the midst of landslides, enormous holes or crevasses, the very shelter where our men are hiding. Nevertheless, at the end of an hour of searching, at the foot of a staircase with muddy steps, booming voices called out in answer to us. It was them. Our gun crew having received the order to be relieved, we decided to leave at around 3 in the morning. I led the way and served as guide, with my sole landmarks a dead body and the 3 telephone poles. Nobody got lost, and the return trip was less eventful, but our hands weren't in our pockets. We had to take turns lugging our cannon and our supply of shells. When we reached Hardecourt, we had hoped to find Thumazou, but he hadn't come back. which made everyone worried and filled me with anguish. How the devil had this descendant of the Arverni come to be among us Southerners? A mystery, the whim of a rear-echelon recruiting clerk. But he enjoyed himself in our company, and liked and admired the petulance, the glibness, the picturesque expressions, the sonorous curses, all of which characterized the Southern spirit and personality. As he was a cabinet maker, we had baptized him Pastepot. Finally, that afternoon, we had the pleasure of seeing Pastepot appear, albeit in a pitiful condition, barely recognizable, muddy, covered with dirt and clay. But yes, it was him, without a fingernail or a hair missing. What a sigh of relief for me! At any moment I had expected an orderly to rise up in front of me and haul me before a scowling brass hat, having to answer this terrifying question. "Corporal Barthas, what have you done with Private Thumazoo?" As if I didn't have to watch out for the blows which might fall upon me, I had to be responsible for those which might fall upon others. When he had regained his strength, Pastepot was called upon to explain his mysterious disappearance. He'd been carrying containers of wine and coffee for the men of his gun crew. To quench their thirst, those fellows had to drink water swimming with microbes, drawn from a shell hole. He told us that just as he reached the Circe shelters along with us, in the midst of frightful shellfire, Frace had taken a particularly bad spill. Thumazoo charitably went to help him get up, but then he himself tumbled into an enormous crater. He called out to Frace as loudly as he could, but was the latter stricken with sudden deafness, or had he simply not heard him, as he claimed? A mystery. In any case, Thumazoo found himself alone, in the middle of a torrent of fire and metal. He dashed off like a madman, wandered all night long in the woods and the deserted ruins of Morval, and ended up, by daylight, finding some shelters occupied by territorials, who helped him, then made his way back to Hardecourt. Bad luck rarely arrives alone. The same night that we lost Thumazoo at Morval, somebody stole, or in military terms pinched, the wheels of our field gun right off their axle, near our shelter in Hardecourt, big iron wheels, upon which we hauled our cannon on the march. There were no thieves in Hardecourt, nor were there any folks who had come there to kill, or to get themselves killed, but some gun crew of a 37, having lost its own wheels in some morass, made do with ours. This was no small affair. Gunners who let the wheels of their cannon be stolen away. It put the gun crew's driver, 2 haulers and me at risk of being sent back to our companies, not to mention disciplinary sanctions. We, the victims of the theft, were going to be punished instead of the thieves. We lost some sleep and appetite as a result. From one day to the next, from hour to hour, with the Germans not firing, the encampment at Hardecourt grew in size, expanded wildly, pell-mell, to the delight of everyone there. There were people from all the corners of the universe: Australians, Canadians, Hindus, Negroes, Yellows, Redskins. One could have called it an exodus of peoples, of tribes fleeing before a scourge or departing for some far-off crusade.